Hi there and welcome to the advanced archive video where I'm going to go through a bunch of things that weren't covered in the basic archive video. And we're going to kick off with some things that you'll find down in the advanced options section of the product down here. File filters apply to all of the modules, so they will be included in a general advanced video, not this particular video. But in this video I will show you manage indexes and access to indexes. So let's start with access to indexes. Basically, when you are browsing storage or indexes, you are browsing via objects which exist in this access to indexes. So strictly speaking, it's not just access to indexes that's provided here, it's also access to file systems. So you'll see that the default archive index is included here, and in addition you'll see the backup index for client MacBook, actually it'll be Mac Mini server, is included here, and backup index for client localhost. In fact, if we sort this list, it might be a bit easier to go through. So the top three things in this list are indexes, and those basically are exposed when you go to restore, and when you go to backup you see a backup index for localhost, the local machine, and for the Mac Mini server. And when you go to restore archive, you see the default archive index, and then you can browse into that index and find things that we've archived. Now, if we go back to access to indexes, and these objects are the things which allow you to browse those three indexes. By double clicking on any one of these, you can see the properties for it. So in the case of this login area, it has a name, backup index for client localhost. It has a index or file system that it points to. So this is the backup index for localhost that it points to. And then it has a path within that index that it will take you to. So by default, clicking on restore backup and then the localhost backup index takes you to the top level of the index, which is signified by the slash symbol. But we could modify this, so by browsing we are able to browse within this index, and if we wanted to we could have this object point directly to the preferences folder within the backup index. So now, make that change and save it. If I go to restore and backup and localhost, I'm now looking at the preferences folder within that index rather than being able to browse this index from the top. So this probably isn't what you'd want to do, but I'm just illustrating how this setting changes things. So if we go back to that index now and put it back to the original setting, which was to browse from the top level of the index, then it will do what it did before. But the nice thing about this is that you can add additional new login areas. So, for example, if I wanted to allow users to browse in the backup index for localhost, but easily go directly to the preferences folder, I can create a new login area, and I could call it restore localhost prefs, for example, just to be a bit descriptive about what this is going to do. And it's going to point to the backup index for localhost, and the path, we want that to go directly to the preferences folder within the folder structure in this index. So there we go. Now down at the bottom you can choose which user groups are able to see and use this login area. So currently these login areas are restricted so that only admin users can see them, but if you remove the admin group, then non-admins will be able to log into Archiware and browse these login areas. And that will also be covered in the general advanced video, the topic of allowing non-admin users to use the web interface to perform certain tasks. So we've created a new login area there. I'm going to apply that, close it, and now if we go to restore backup, you'll see that the restore localhost prefs object now also exists in this list because we just created it. And by clicking in there, we get to go directly to that part of the index, and then we could choose to restore some preference files. So this is a convenience for users, and it allows them to access important bits of index to restore from without having to drill down through an entire index structure that might not make sense to them. So if we go back to the access to indexes section and go a bit further down the list. So I said that the top three were all indexes, the top two being backup indexes and the third one being access to the default archive index. These ones down here, these two in fact, are file system access, and they are allowing access to the file systems on the local host machine and the file systems on the Mac Mini server. So what happens is that one of these is created for each new client that you add to the server, and by default these new login areas just allow the browsing of storage that's connected to each one of those clients. So that means that if we are in any window which requires that we're browsing file systems, these are the login areas that will allow access to those file systems. So, for example, if I were configuring a archive plan, like if we go and edit this one that we already created, and there's some place in the archive plan that allows us to browse file systems, like the automatic archive section, where we build a list of folders that we want to automatically archive, and wherever we have a file browser button, then we will see any additional login areas that we create in this file browser window. So let me show you what that means. If this sample pictures folder on the desktop is a folder which is important and we need to easily be able to access, then we can add that folder as a login area. So we go access to indexes, new, give it a name, so let's just call it sample pics folder, and then choose where we want this login area to take us. So we want it to point to this folder on the desktop. So that's the online database for client localhost. So that's this one here, HFS localhost. That means file systems on the localhost client. And then rather than just browsing from the top level, which would look like this, it's from the top level of the hard drive, we can choose to go to that sample pics folder. So I know that folder is in users, P5 demo, desktop sample pics, so that will fill in the path for us, and we're done. So now if I go back to edit my archive plan and go back to the window that requires that I choose some storage, you'll now see that the login area appears at the top of the list. So as well as being able to browse the entire disk from the top level, we now have easy access to the sample pictures folder. So that is also going to be available to us in any other part of the product where we get to browse file systems, including manual archiving. So if we go to manual archiving, we immediately see all of the browsable file system login areas, and if we were interested in browsing in archiving from the sample pics folder, we're now just one click away from being able to select things in that folder to archive. So this is really useful where you've got an Archiware server in an environment where the users need to be able to see shares, so that the server is probably sharing out storage with volume or share names to replicate those share names within Archiware, so that the users can see the same storage objects that they see on their desktops within the product, within the Archiware web interface. Okay, so that's login areas or access to indexes, and the next thing I'm going to show you is manage indexes. Now, one of the features with the archive product is that the archive index, so the database into which files that you've archived are placed, is a database that can have custom fields added to it, just like a kind of regular database. So if you're installing P5 Archive for a customer, and that customer is going to be doing lots of archiving where each archive is based around a job number, then you can provide a job number field, or whatever they'd like that field to be called, within the default archive database, and then they can either manually fill that field in when they manually archive via the web interface, such that they will later be able to search on the contents of that field and find resources in the archive index that they might want to restore, or you can use these fields that you've added to the archive index and have them automatically filled in by extracting metadata from the files, from the assets that you're archiving, extracting the data from within the files at the point that they're being archived, and then storing the data, the metadata that you've extracted in the archive index itself in fields that you've specifically added to the archive index for that purpose. So, in order to add fields to the archive index, you need to go to the Manage Indexes section down here under Advanced Options and locate the database that you want to add the fields to. Now it's possible to, from this list of indexes, it is also possible to add via the New button a new archive index. So if you wish, you can create multiple archive indexes that will all be stored separately from one another, and a given archive plan can then target the archive index of your choice. So by default, the default archive index is created, and any archive plans that you create will automatically point their data at that archive index. But you can create a second and third index and so on, and then point different archive plans at different indexes. Now the main reason you might want to do that is if you have, if the customer using P5 Archive is archiving data for several clients, separate clients, and they want to subdivide and keep their clients' data and archive indexes completely independent and separate from one another. So that's how you would create another archive index. You basically click on the New button and provide a name and an optional description, and that's it. There's no other options, and that will create you a fresh separate archive index, and then you can use that from an archive plan for as you wish. Okay, we're not going to do that now. What I'm going to do is highlight our existing archive index and click on Fields, and this will bring up the field editor window, and you can see that across the top there are column headings. So we've got field settings, which comprise a description and a type, and then we've got the layout, which basically determines how this field is represented and displayed in the UI in the web browser. And there is one field called description, which is added to the default archive index on installation, just as really so that you've got an example to work with. So let's kick off by adding a couple of fields to our archive index. I'm going to add the first field, and I'm going to call that one job number, and this is going to be of type text, because although it's a number, it might require that characters are used in there as well. This internal name is the name that scripts, and we'll look at scripts later, will use to identify this field. The application name is the label that will be used for the field in the web interface. So in here I'm going to type job space number with upper and lower case, because that's nicer to look at when we're displaying the field. The comment is optional. I'm going to skip the comment, and this is going to be displayed as a text field as opposed to a drop-down list, and this is a small piece of data, so one row within the UI will be okay to display it, and I'd like this to be displayed second in the list. And then if I hit the plus button at the end of the row, that field will be added to the other field at the top, and we're going to notice saying that the field has been added and updated. And now I'm going to add a second field, and this field is going to be called color space, spelt the English way, and the display will be color space. I guess I'll use all one word for that, and another text field, another single row, and we'll have this one third in the list. And these are user added fields, so you can see that P5 prepends user underscore to the name that I'm providing. And the third field, just to illustrate what a drop down list looks like, we'll just call this one drop down example, and drop down example, and this is going to be a drop down list. And then this box here allows me to edit the items in that list, so I could have yellow, blue, red, orange, orange off the top of my head. So this list now consists of 4 options that will be shown in a drop-down menu, and there are only 4 possible choices at this point for this field. And again, a single row, and we'll display this number 4. Okay, so now we've added some fields to our archive index. Let's take a look at how they can be manually filled out when we actually perform an archive job. So we can close this. We already have an archive index created here, and this archive index is archiving to the default archive pool, so that's fine. So if I manually archive some sample pics, then we'll see how Archiware will prompt us to enter some of those fields that exist in the index at the point that we archive. So if I click archive on these JPEG files, there's a tick box here that allows me to see the metadata fields that exist in the archive index so that I can manually enter them. So these fields are fill-inable at this point, including the drop-down menu, and all of this information will be stored in the archive index against these JPEGs. So if I put a job number of 12345 and then allow this archive to run and monitor the execution of that job so I can see when it's completed. Just have a look at the additional detail. So that job has now completed, and it's archived those 5 JPEG files. So the result of that will be, if we go to restore from the archive and browse the archive index, and then browse down to the sample pics folder that we archived. If I sort this list by date, you can see these 5 at the top were archived today, the 1st of June, as opposed to 1st of July, sorry, as opposed to the files beneath which were archived on the 10th of June, 3 weeks ago. So these fields, these 4 files at the top in the index will have that additional job number stored against them, but by default we can't see that because we're not displaying that column. So if I go over to the View button on the right hand side, you'll see the additional fields we added to the archive index are displayed here for inclusion in this column view. So let's display job number and apply that. At this point we get dropped back at the top of the index structure, so we just need to browse down again. And now we see in this column, which we can actually drag over here, we have our job number. And likewise, if we were going to be doing a search, we could search job number for 12345, and that would reveal those particular files that were archived under that job reference. So that's how you add new fields to the archive index and then fill those fields in manually when you're archiving through the browser interface, and then allow yourself to be able to view and sort and search by that metadata that you added to the archive index. Now you could insert data into those same fields, for example the job number or the color space, by automatically doing so at the point that you're archiving the files by using a script. And this is configured via the within the archive plan in the section which is labeled Metadata Import. Okay, so there are no scripts in here at the moment, but let's say that we wanted to extract the color space from the files that we're archiving to allow us to view and search on color space later on. Now we've already created the color space field and added it to our index, so the next step is to use this area to add a script and associate it with a certain file type. So the way this works is that you at the top you specify a match for the types of files that you want this script to run against to extract metadata. So for example, most of the files in this folder are JPEG files, so I could enter in here star.jpg to match any JPEG file where that expression matches the file name, and then I can specify a script. So this is a shell script or a script in any language that you want. Could be a batch file on Windows, for example. And finally you specify a timeout value which is the maximum amount of time you expect your script to take to generate its output. This way, if a script doesn't exit and return control back to the archive plan, it will be timed out after the number of seconds that you specify, so that the entire archive job isn't held up by a script which isn't executing properly. So what we need now is a script which is able to extract color space from the files, and then that can be entered back into the archive index, and we can search on it for the JPEGs that we'll archive. Now what I'm going to do now is point you to the Archiware website, and on that site there is under resources there's a page called sample scripts, and we're going to use part of one of the scripts which is available in here just to illustrate how this works. So there is a script here, number 4, import metadata into fields of P5 Archive, and there's a description down here pretty much of what I'm describing to you. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at this script, and this is what the script looks like. And if I copy this script and I'm going to run a text editor and enter the script in here so that I can modify it a little and then save it somewhere. So let's take a quick look at this script and see what it does. There are basically 6 items of metadata that this script will attach, and those are color space, pixel width, pixel height, find a comment, acquisition, make and model, which relate to digital cameras, and the make and model of the camera which has generated a file. Now the mdls command here is actually a command which exists on OS X, and mdls will output the selected metadata item from a given file. And in fact, if we run a terminal window and I type mdls, we'll get the basic help text for that command. And what we can do is run mdls again, but this time provide one of those JPEG files to see what it tells us about that file. So if we just do that, drag the file into the terminal, you can see that the output, and there's quite a lot of output there, gives us metadata about the file, including this item here, color space, and you'll see that that matches the item that's requested in the script. So what I'm going to do is edit the script so that it just runs mdls once against the input file, and what the script does is it will take the value provided by the color space query against the file, which will be this RGB value here in the case of the file that we've used as an example, and it puts that value into this attrib1 variable, and then once it's collected that information, the output consists of the field name that we want within the default archive index that we want to place this value into, followed by the attribute in curly braces. So to make this work with our index that we modified a moment ago, what we need to do is remind ourselves what we called the color space field that we want to enter this value into. So if we go to Manage Indexes and go to Default Archive and view the fields again, then the value that we're interested in is user color space. So I'm just going to copy that, and then I'm going to edit my script, and in fact I think that matches except for the extra U that I like to use, and this will be the ATTR1 value that we're placing this value into, so that's correct. So I can remove the rest of this line because we're just extracting a single value for simplicity's sake, and then I'm going to save this script to my desktop, and I'll call it extract color space .sh onto the desktop where we can see it. Okay, there's our script. Now there's one more step here, and that is that you'll need to make this script executable in order that it can be executed and run as a program by Archiware when the archive job is running. And to do that, we'll use the terminal, and I'll use the chmod command to add execute permission to this file, which I'll specify by dragging it in and hitting return. Okay, so that's done. So now what we can do, and while I'm in the terminal actually, I'm going to copy the full path to this script because that will be useful to enter into Archiware's interface. So what we can do now is go back to our archive plan, visit the Metadata Import section, add a new Metadata Import script where the expression that we're looking to match is JPEG files, because the files in our folder here are .jpg files. Of course, you could have several items in the list. You could have TIFFs and PSDs depending on what your script is able to deal with. Then we specify the full path to our extract color space script that we've got down here, and a timeout of 30 seconds should be ample to generate that, to extract that metadata. And we're done. So now, if we visit our sample pics folder and do an archive of the top 5 files, this time we're not looking to manually enter any of this data in because the color space field at least is going to be filled in by our script. So we now run that job, and once the job has finished executing, the output from the job will tell us how many pieces of metadata or how many files metadata was extracted for. So you can see here 5 pieces of metadata, or rather 5 out of 5 files had metadata loaded into the index. So now all we need to do to see what was extracted is visit the default archive index, and before I go any further I'm going to just include the color space field in my column view and then browse down into the sample pics folder, and you can see now that the 5 most recently archived files now have RGB in the color space field, because that was extracted by our script, by this command here, by the MDLS list color space, which was put into the user color space field. So that now exists in the database, and we could now search if we wanted to for files where color space contains RGB, and that will find, plus some ones that were archived earlier. And if we view the information pane for a given file, it will also show us that the color space field is set to RGB. This information pane also allows us to set fields manually. So for example, I could assign the color blue in this field against that file, and then that would be permanently stored in the archive index that this value here was blue for this particular asset. Okay, so that's how we use scripts within an archive plan to extract metadata from the files themselves and store that data within the archive index. Next, we're going to look at preview generation using scripts. Right, so here we have a Linux OS. This is actually CentOS 6.5, which is very similar to Red Hat. And I've got P5 running on here, and we have an archive plan already set up, which is pretty much similar to what we were looking at before. Now what I'm going to show you is how we can do preview generation on Linux, where the default preview generations options are not going to work because they rely on QuickTime, and there is no QuickTime here on Linux. So what I have done is installed ImageMagick, which is a package that you can install via, well, on CentOS. It's simply a case of doing yum install ImageMagick with a K on the end, and this will tell me that there's nothing to do because it's already installed, because I installed it earlier. Now ImageMagick provides a command convert, which and that's the usage for convert. And what convert will do is it will take an image and convert it into a smaller image of a different type, different color space. There's lots and lots of options in there, and it's a free open source package. So we can use ImageMagick within our archive plan to generate previews, and likewise we can use a tool like FFmpeg, which does the same kind of job, but for video it does video transcoding. And we can utilize those tools to generate previews of videos and static images. Now on the Archiware website, again under the resources and then sample scripts, if I search for Linux, there is a script here, Archiware archive previews of image files on Linux using ImageMagick. And if we take a look at this script, and initially I'm just going to open that and take a look at it, you can see that this script, once we get past all the comments, and many thanks to whoever provided this script for the Archiware website, credit to them, the script basically calls the convert program as installed by ImageMagick, and it passes to it the file which is currently being archived, whatever that might be, and it uses the thumbnail command to generate a 128 pixel square thumbnail and then passes that back to us again. So the script is really simple, and out is defined as a file name under the temp folder, which will be under the AW folder, and we just generate a file name for output, which is going to be a PNG with a random number so that all the files are uniquely, or hopefully uniquely, named. Now I have a copy of this script on my desktop here, which I will just indicate to you that I've made a couple of changes. I've increased the thumbnail size there to 512 pixels on the longest side, and I'm also using the flatten option because otherwise the convert program will output layers within a Photoshop file as separate PNGs on the output side. So flatten will just provide me with one thumbnail rather than several, which will not work. So a couple of minor changes there to that script. So what we'll do is we'll go into our existing training archive plan, pop into the preview generation, and I'm going to add a new user-defined preview generator, and this will work with JPEG files and Photoshop files, which are star.psd files. And I'm just going to put my script path onto there. Just remove a few of the extra characters that have resulted from dragging it, and I think 30 seconds for my timeout value should be fine. So, oops, I forgot to click the plus sign to add both file types. So my script will at least work with JPEGs and PSDs. There's lots of other file formats that convert will also work with, but you might need to fine-tune the script to your own purposes. So that's all set up. So I'm going to close that. On the desktop, I've got a folder that's got some JPEG files in it and also a Photoshop file. Okay, so we're going to archive that folder. So I pop into manual archiving, browse down through root, desktop, and locate that folder. Say archive, submit the job, monitor the job, and once the job's finished it will tell me how many previews it's generated. So you can see here there are 11 files, and it should be generating 11 clips, which means that thumbnails have been generated for all 11 files, and it tells us here that it took 2.72 megabytes to store those 11 PNG files. So if we now browse into our archive index, and if I just close those bits now, just go down to desktop sample pictures, the little green icons here signify that the preview has been generated for each of these files. You get a blank kind of rectangle icon if no preview was generated, and there are our 11 previews, and because they're 512 pixels we can actually use the slider here. It doesn't actually go beyond 256, but you can see they're nice clear previews of those files that have now been archived, including this one, which is actually a layered Photoshop file, and you can see that Convert has been able to nicely generate a thumbnail of that one as well. So that is a quick overview of how you write a script or take a script that's already been generated and maybe tweak the script a bit based on your knowledge of the tool that the script is using to perform the conversions, and then hook that into your archive plan. So we did that within the preview generation section within the archive plan, added a line which calls our script, and when certain file types are encountered being archived, the script is called and will generate thumbnails. It's worth noting that on the actual file system, if we browse this computer's disk and we look in user local AW config index archive, here's our default archive index. These are the database files that comprise that index, and the clips folder contains our preview files. So we make various folders under clips. This one is 5, but each time you run a job you'll be a different folder generated, and those clips are actually the PNG files which are displayed within the web interface when you go browsing the interface and looking at the thumbnails. So as you can see from the last few minutes, there are quite a few different ways that you can customize and incorporate different workflows into the archive product, and I hope that's helped you in your use of the product for the future. Thanks for watching.